Fantastic. Well, thank you guys all for joining us this afternoon. I think it's afternoon, so we can afternoon. Welcome to the Atlantic Council and an event here, a first in a couple of months from the Cyber Statecraft Initiative. We're going to be having a short conversation between myself and Michael Martell, who is the Cyber Vault Fellow at the National Security Archive, the gentleman who's actually responsible for putting this cache together, working it through the FOIA process, and bringing it out to the public. He and I are going to talk a bit about the archive, how it works, what it does, and how it sits in cybersecurity. And then we're going to welcome up the rest of our panelists here for a fairly enlightening conversation on Joint Task Force Ares and Operation Glowing Symphony. So I look forward to the discussion. We'll then move into a town hall format. So we encourage conversational questions from the audience. I'll be moderating that, and we hope we can make some use of your time. So thank you guys all for showing up. Let's get it started. Michael, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. So if you would, tell us a bit about what the archive is, what it does, and how it works.
Sure. So the National Security Archive was founded in 1985 by a group of journalists and scholars who sort of realized that a bunch of people had these primary source government policy documents they'd already written their papers on, they'd written their stories on, they were sitting around not really being of resource or of use to people. And so compiled them together and started producing this resource for study. The unique range of functions of the National Security Archive is to drive FOIA research specifically, but also to serve as a bit of a research institute on international affairs and international affairs history, and to serve as a library and an archive of declassified US documents. Of all the projects in the National Security Archive, my project, the Cyber Vault, was the most recent, began in 2016. And we function in much the same way, but applied to the cyber field. The topic we're talking about today, Joint Task Force Ares and Operation Glowing Symphony, these are documents that came out through FOIA declassification. I want to make sure that credit goes out to all the right folks on this. In July of 2016, Ellen Nakashima of the Washington Post and Missy Ryan had the first report that named Joint Task Force Ares. And that led to a series of FOIA requests on the topic. And then a follow-on Nakashima piece revealed the name of Operation Glowing Symphony. And actually, it was Joseph Cox of Motherboard, his FOIA request, which ultimately released that second piece of documents. We compiled those two sets of documents and produced the record as we know it today.
That's fantastic. So in thinking about the way the archive has functioned in the last 30 or 40 years, what is different in cybersecurity? What have you had to adapt to?
Well, cybersecurity is obviously a much younger field than a lot of the other topics we address at the National Security Archive. There's still declassification projects around the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. It's fairly unique that Joint Task Force Ares has declassified documents when it is an ongoing Joint Task Force. That's pretty unique to declassification processes that we've been involved in. The other struggle, or not so much a struggle as it is a blessing in disguise, is there is a lot of open source documents. I think likely as a result of the public-private partnership aspect of cyber, there is a lot of information out there, and so we also try to serve as a bit of a curating function for these documents.
Interesting. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, thinking about why does cybersecurity, if it is this young, need an archive or need an archiving function?
It may be young, but it certainly has a history, right? And as we're trying to answer these questions about the future of cybersecurity, the future of security in a cyber age, the best data set we have available to us is history. Unfortunately, a lot of that history is locked up behind classification, or it was selectively released in ways that might alter our perception of the field. And so bringing these documents to light for study and for ultimately policy analysis, I think, is absolutely vital.
Interesting. Okay. So thinking about what these documents are, turning to the actual JTF
Sure.
Ares cache, what do we see here? What did you guys uncover?
So we uncovered, I guess in chronological order, a call for cyber support to Operation Inherent Resolve, right? That then led to the foundation of a joint task force, and after the foundation of Joint Task Force Ares, we saw the authorization of Operation Glowing Symphony. There were a couple interesting points to me in all these documents. The one that still jumps out to me is the absolute scale of this. In the initial order for support to Operation Inherent Resolve, it lists the area of interest as global. There are a lot of really interesting points that come out of that I'm sure we'll discuss later. But coming down to the personnel requirement for something like that, notification planning, just coalition building. These are all really interesting questions, and actually General Nakasone has referenced a lot of these experiences in Joint Task Force Ares is directly informing how the current Russia small group was formed and operates, which I find very interesting.
Interesting. So we're seeing an existing feedback loop then between these operations and contemporary activities.
A learning process, I'd say, yeah.
Interesting. So from thinking about the documents that you have here, where have they generally come from? So you talked a little bit about the composition, but what are the source?
So the ultimate source of these is US Stratcom. US Cybercom was a component of it at the time. I will say, to give some kudos, US Stratcom and US Cybercom have actually been quite forthcoming in the FOIA process. And that was actually something that took us somewhat by surprise given the recency of some of these documents. There are obviously redactions, but there's quite a bit to work with in these documents, and I want to commend them on that.
What would you usually expect through a FOIA process with this kind of entity?
A much longer turnaround time, for one.
Turnaround time?
Yes,
Okay.
a much longer turnaround time. But even beyond the Joint Task Force areas and glowing Symphony FOIA campaigns, there have been other requests that we've sent their way about the building of the cyber force, the building of the cyber mission teams. Recently, we had a post on a discussion of targeting procedures in cyberspace. Often when it comes to US Cybercom, we're seeing stuff back in a matter of months, when sometimes in other agencies we're talking years.
Any thought on why that might be the case?
Some, but none that I really have any visibility to speak to.
Does the command have any kind of historical function or archiving piece of their own?
They do, yes. I believe Michael Warner is the command historian over there. And I know that they've, just from conversations with him, they definitely value the fact that cybersecurity does have a history and it's policy relevant.
Interesting, okay. So thinking about the documents that we have here, based on the work that you've done with them and what you've seen, what do you feel like comes next in this discussion, specifically about Joint Task Force Ares and Glowing Symphony?
From a policy study perspective, determining cost and determining effect. It is unclear from what's been declassified so far what the personnel requirements are, the labor hours that went into this, what actually goes into conducting an operation of this type. And then on the other end of it, how is success defined, how is success measured, how is success determined? And I think that goes into any discussion of policy. What's the cost, what's the effect? And I hope eventually that information's declassified where we can start to understand in a public sense the cost effectiveness of cyber operations in this manner.
How far back do these documents go chronologically?
Back to 2015, I believe, is the earliest
2015,
one.
so we're looking back about 4 years for this discussion.
Correct.
Okay, interesting. And then I guess the last question I'd have for you is thinking about what you've told us about the role that CyberVault has in cybersecurity, the role of the National Security Archive, and this kind of policy work. What's next for the archive, or what's next on your list within the work that the Vault is doing?
So the one on my desk right now is some, again, FOIA declassified documents on US Cybercom wargaming. There's some interesting points to be drawn out of there in terms of how cyber warfare, if you choose to use that term, is expected to be fought, who's expected to fulfill what roles. I'm a big fan of finding documents from war games because it's a slightly less sensitive way to look at concepts and modes of operating in a way that we can discuss, again, in a policy relevant way. So that's what's on the desk right now, but who knows what comes in the FOIA envelope next week.
It's interesting. So we'll hope the mailmans bring you something exciting.
Yes.
Well, on that, I think we want to bring up the rest of the panel so we can broaden this discussion a little bit. So if you guys would all join me briefly in thanking Michael and the work that the National Security Archive has been doing on this topic. And if we would welcome the panelists up.
Slide down to Mike.
Yeah, go ahead. All right. Okay. Thank you guys. And then so if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to take just a second to introduce the group that we have in the discussion here. So Michael you've met, but Michael is the CyberVault, the inaugural CyberVault Fellow at the National Security Archive. Did his graduate work here at GW. Just one down from him is Dr. Nina Collars, an Associate Professor of Strategic and Operational Research at the Naval War College. Nina is also a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point and has, I actually think, done some work on wargaming, if I'm not mistaken, on exactly this context. Next to Nina is Brigadier General Len Anderson, United States Marine Corps, who is the Deputy Commander for Joint Task Force Ares. We thank him very much for joining us today for this discussion. General Anderson is a former Blue Angel from 2002 to 2004, so the one of two combat aviators we have up here today. Sitting next to him is Audrey Alexander, who's Research Associate at the Combating Terrorism Center, also at West Point. Audrey's going to be able to speak a little bit to ISIL and Daesh and the actual impact that these activities have had on the combat environment that they're facing. Audrey did her graduate work at the War Studies Department at King's College London. And finally, next to her, our senior non-resident fellow, Pete Cooper. Pete is also a former combat aviator, spending 24 years with the Royal Air Force, and was an early member of the UK Ministry of Defence's Joint Cyber Unit. He also does some active work for us on aviation cybersecurity, so look for in that space here in the next month soon. So I want to lead off the discussion very quickly and invite you guys all to take a minute or two just to tell us something that you think, based on these documents that you've seen, that would be interesting for our community to think through. Probably start with Pete and then work our way down.
Yeah, thanks. Ironically, though, I mean, apart from wanting to just talk about flying for the next 2 hours, which I'll refrain from, ironically, I'm going to sort of step away from the first topic is really, and then go back, is that the challenge of cybersecurity, protecting the domain and protecting critical infrastructure and sort of everything that the states value, really. If we go back to, in 1999, the publication of the document Unrestricted Warfare by the two Chinese academics, there was a quote in there saying, it talks about where is the battlefield, and the answer to that is the battlefield is everywhere. Now, whenever I talk about this, I add to the end of that, and the bit that we tend to not talk about is the fact that if the battlefield is everywhere, then you're really engaged on it all the time. And that changes really how we start thinking about sort of engagement and defending in this sort of like new age. And Chris Demchak, the Navy academic, who years ago again talked about this as being a cybered conflict. This isn't necessarily the cyber war that Tom Ridd talks about, but necessarily this is a cyber conflict. This is conflict, but now it's just got cybered or cyber layered into it. So we shouldn't be expecting to go for revolution here. This is more of an evolution that we've gone through for many years, be it the birth of aviation, the birth of naval warfare. This is just a next move on. The challenge that we have is that, again, reflecting back to World War I, and Little Hart, who is one of the great sort of strategists of that time, he talks about some of the challenges of World War I and moving into trench warfare and then just stalemate, was the fact that a lot of the leaders at the time were unprepared to lead 1 million men. So they were unprepared for that cognitive leap to be able to cope with what they were being offered as capability at that time. So as the community and as the world order sort of looks at trying to understand what the new cyber domain looks like and makes, it's a real case of having great debate like this in order to help move that on, so that work at the UN, for example, we're talking about norms, are really able to move forwards on this so that it occurs within that international framework of laws.
Always a tough act to follow. So I'm here from the West Point Military Academy's Combating Terrorism Center, and have to caveat that my views are my own. So I can't speak for all of the institutions I'm lucky to work for, including the Army and West Point and the Combating Terrorism Center. So just to dive in, one of the reasons I get to be on this panel, and I'm so lucky to be here, is that looking at what complements the military engagement and all of the other components that the U.S. is sort of leveraging in order to address this problem, namely terrorist exploitation of technology. And what we're focusing on here today is really terrorists in that ideological persuasion of violent extremism. And really one of the core tenets that we have to look at here is how long the US has been having this conversation. Tracing back to 2006 is really the first time we see Congress raise its flag and say, hey, there's this video of the Baghdad sniper. It's spreading like wildfire on YouTube, so what are we gonna do about it? The first place Congress turned was technology providers. And actually, since 2006, a lot of the conversation we see today is kind of the conversation we've been having there, except for our friends over here. Because that's really where a lot of the change in these undercurrents have pushed from a reactive approach to a more proactive, leveraging more proactive measures. So as we get into the discussion today, one of the things that I'll be happy to chat about is, are a lot of our responses just beyond the military, focusing on how terrorists use technology today? So if we look at cases based on court documents of American ISIS sympathizers, what are the tools they're using? Sure, they started off with Facebook, YouTube, but now they've moved into these different toolkits. So we have everything from file sharing services, like Just Paste It and archive.org, a different archive than the Great Archive, National Security Archive. We've got encrypted messengers like Telegram. We have link shorteners, so they're plugging something so that the link doesn't necessarily look like terrorist content. So how do we make policies that really respond to the information landscape that's used by these players and really work to sort of contain and marginalize these threats, not just aim to eradicate them? Because one of the challenges that we need to have early and often, and is something we can see in the documentation that the military is certainly thinking about, is what's the cost benefit here? And what happens when we start putting so much pressure on these asymmetric threats that it starts affecting things like speech and privacy? Because this is a very real problem that we're going to be up against as we start to work against these threats. And increasingly evident from other nations is we see that they're using counterterrorism as a means to develop technology and apply technology that's used beyond the focus of counterterrorism. So I think that that's such an important discussion to have as we discuss the efficiency of these tools and say, are they so efficient that they're efficiently knocking out legitimate voices? So hand it over to you.
All right. As the Deputy Commander of Joint Task Force Ares, I get the pleasure of working with the men and women at Cyber Command that go against some of these problems that we have with violent extremists and online, and particularly with their messaging, media, financing. The normal conduct of violent extremists in their world is normal that we're going to go up against on the internet. So the reason I'm here today in particular is because we don't generally talk a lot about what Cyber Command does due to some of the classifications. It's been made clear for us from the Secretary of Defense and through General Nakasone that we're going to talk a little bit more about what we do as a force so that American people know that we have a force that's out there. We know that that we are inhibiting some of the violent extremist actions through cyber, and that we want you all to understand what we do, to trust what we do, and know that there are professionals that are out there working today, as I sit here, against the problem of violent extremists online. And yes, that includes a global effort from Joint Task Force Ares. So we'll get into a few of those specifics, I think, as we discuss some of these things, and in particular with Glowing Symphony and how we got to where we are today. But I'm particularly proud of being part of Joint Task Force Ares for sure, as we now have that under Joint Force Headquarters Marines. I know it sounds a little complicated, but we've put all of our offensive cyber capabilities under each individual service in their Joint Force Headquarters. We have chosen to keep the brand Joint Task Force Ares because of its importance with Glowing Symphony and some of the, I would say, benchmarks that we have accomplished in Cyber Command along the way under that name. And it's recognized by the intelligence community, the counter-terrorist basically enterprise that's out there working against this problem. So when you hear that label, it's kind of one in each. I do represent MAR Force Cyber, and I work for Major General Glavy, who is the commander of Joint Task Force Ares. Thanks.
I inherently mistrust handheld microphones. Okay. Oh, hey, it's working. Perfect. Thanks. All right. So I'm here today partially as a representative of the Naval War College, and so much like the rest of the people who are DoD civilians or active DoD, anything that I say on this stage is meant to be my opinion only, and it's not meant to necessarily represent the DoD. But as a second note, currently there is an initiative, a commission that's been put together by Congress called the Solarium Task Force, the Cyberspace Solarium Task Force. And this task force has been put together to study, in particular, the articulation and the clarification of what's called defending forward and persistent engagement. And if you haven't heard those two phrases, a quick Google will help you sort of get oriented on it. But it's meant to articulate, at a minimum, Cyber Command, but more broadly, a U.S. national sea change in how we think the United States should be operating in cyberspace. My role on that particular commission has to do with the first part of the task force, which looks at the military arm and what the military arm should be doing in terms of how we should conduct ourselves in cyberspace in a way that is consistent with U.S. values, international law, and our partners and allies. And that sounds nice, but it's actually a really hard question to look at because we're all on a learning curve trying to figure out how to make this happen. In particular, in reference to Joint Task Force Ares, if you've read Mike's work at all, you'll see that it it's inconclusive, and we're all trying to figure out what this means more broadly for how we should conduct ourselves. So rather than answers, I have sort of 3 leading questions that, that come to mind as I think about this. And first is the difference between planning and doing operations against non-state actors versus state actors. So it strikes me as being the case, again, based on just sort of basic detection, that non-state actors probably operate on public networks more often, have fewer hardened systems, whatever systems they have that are secure and encrypted are available openly on the market. And so it strikes me as being the case that the way one would go about dismantling and degrading the capabilities of non-state actors would be fundamentally different. It also strikes me as being the case that if you plan to do operations against another state, depending on if you're in competition, if you're in crisis, or if you're in conflict, there are different kinds of laws. It doesn't mean that there aren't laws, but there are different kinds of laws and different kinds of coordination that have to happen state by state. So I ask, okay, well, if Joint Task Force Ares is a case, what is it a case of, and what can we learn from it in contrast to state-on-state conflict? The second is this a good case study of conflict or competition? The United States has had a footprint as a result of the events of September 11th for a very long time in the Middle East. And this, in my mind, is a continuation of a long path of conflict in that area. A long set of operations that we have done to work and push back against. In this case, it's going to be ISIL. So insofar as that's the case, is that an instance of competition, or is it an instance of conflict? And then again, what does that mean for how we do shop within the DoD? And then finally, and this is the part that makes me, I was surprised at the speed at which the documents came to the National Security Archive, and it struck me as being a case that if we can learn from this, what are our adversaries learning? And that's the thing that makes me most concerned, but also I don't see any other way to learn how to do this. But so those are my sets of questions to think about as we continue in this conversation. Thank you.
So if I was to take my historian hat off for a moment and put policy analyst hat and think about what we've learned about here, something that jumps out to my mind is often cyber capabilities, or the qualitative aspect of cyber capabilities, is discussed in terms of how hardened of a target can you affect, how sophisticated of a single operation can you execute. I think what Joint Task Force Ares and Operation Glowing Symphony show us is a different model of that, which is, as you mentioned, these aren't necessarily hardened targets. These aren't necessarily the air-gapped industrial control systems. What it is scale. If we're going to go to old strategists, I'd reference Wiley here in terms of a linear versus a parallel operation. This struck me as a parallel operation. It wasn't a single sequence of reconnaissance, escalation, pivoting, effect on target, like we've seen in other more famous operations. In this case, it was or still is rather, a long-term series of simultaneous operations that aren't necessarily mutually dependent on each other for the eventual success of, and at this point I'm just defining parallel operations as per Wiley. But I think this raises some really interesting questions about how a nation builds a cyber force. Depending on what you want to do with it, do you want a few very high-end operators? Do you want several competent operators able to affect more lower-tier targets at once across an operation? And I think those are some interesting, not a new model for operating in cyberspace, certainly, but I think maybe a new display of it, a new example for us to discuss along those lines.
This is interesting. So I want to open this up for questions again. We're kind of trying to push this town hall format, but I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative once. Thinking about what each of you have said, it jumps out that there's starting to be some difference in the way we build, operate, man, train, equip, and fight these kinds of missions against the entities that we're talking about. And it's not clear how much of that is wrapped up into this being focused on cyber effects versus this particular set of entities being focused on a non-state actor. To the extent that you want to comment, I'm just curious from your experience, how big was the delta in what you had seen and how you had previously experienced these operations, how you trained to fight these kinds of conflicts versus what you were being asked to do? Was it a quick adjustment? Was it a little bit of a mental switch? Or was this something where you had to really sit down and think through conflict and the nature of conflict as you were being presented to have a role in it?
Sure, I'll talk to, GTF Ares started because of the need of a focused effort on a particular enemy. So the task force construct, I wasn't with GTF Ares at the time, but the task force construct, as we brought in people from across the agency, and I'm talking across NSA, across Cyber Command, the intelligence community, to bring a focused effort onto what the enemy was doing online. We saw that ISIS had obviously learned how to use the internet and social media for all of their messaging purposes. That was making a significant impact on the recruitment, which was of course going to follow on and cause more foreign terrorist fighters to be in the area of hostility. So that was a really rapid rise, and for context, it took about 90 days, right, to fully go in and understand what the enemy's doing. And I will say this with JTF Ares, about 90% of what we do is intelligence. We have to understand what the enemy's doing and where they are. It's that cyber capability that allows us to learn more about the enemy and illuminate their networks and find out how they're using their financing, how they're using different modes to communicate on the internet, is the purpose of us developing that network so we can offer options to the commander that's not only in the AOR, but perhaps a cybercom commander to go, here's what we know about the enemy or the adversary, and here's the options that are on the table for you. Sometimes we'll get directed to go in after a particular a particular node or some other aspect of how the adversary is operating, but quite honestly, most of that comes from intelligence. So we rely a lot on the national intelligence. Our partnership with the National Security Agency is a huge part of what we do in the counterterrorism world. We're overlapped with the targets that we're looking for and trying to get after. So our mission very well aligns in the counterterrorism side. And quite honestly, I'm so busy with the work that I do, I couldn't really talk to what the state actor groups are doing because we are completely focused on the counterterrorism side. So to get there, to answer your question, JTF Ares comes up 90 days. We have some success. I don't want to summarize this too much, but now this, what we have at Ares has been a model for success when we do have something to get after in Cyber Command. And we've seen that with the Russia small group, elections, and everything, and some other things that have been referred to in articles online. So there is definitely a learning process. We weren't built, it's a new command. We weren't built to what we discovered was the appropriate way to do it. Maybe a balance of operators versus analysts. Thank you for using the term operators, by the way. They're not hackers. They are very skilled at what they do, and they also have to understand law and policy, and they're professional. And I haven't seen a single hoodie since I've been there. So they're really good at what they do. So I'm happy to be talking about finally what these men and women are out there doing on a daily basis.
Good to go. I'm going to go to Nina as well here.
So just to supplement and elevate what General Anderson's talking about and to put a pin in it, so much of what he just explained to you about how this comes together is based on well-trod, well-established military practices, doctrine. So much of what he's explaining gets done is a function of good intelligence gathering, about putting the picture together, and on top of it, that final bit becomes the cyber component. And so that's to Pete's point, that so much of what we're looking at is not cyber forward, but essentially all the ways in which digital connectivity and computers can make it that much more effective in doing day-to-day operations.
Thinking through that, as we've heard a little bit about JTF Ares and some of these process questions, I want to go back out to the audience. Questions here, down here front, sir. Yeah, you should have one. Sir, mic's in the back. Should be right here on your left. If you just identify yourself and your organization as well.
Of course. Zach Friarbiggs with the Center for Public Integrity. So to Dr. Coller's point earlier about the challenges of dealing with a non-state actor, a lot of this sort of cyber activity is occurring in gray space. And so the question then becomes, what are the limitations as to authority to operate in gray space? So I did want to ask, going back to the sort of PPD-20 model, and I guess this is really directed at Mike, historically, how much of a limitation was that gray space nature of ISIS limiting the ability to act effectively when it came to cybercom. And then moving forward, and I guess to go to General Anderson, now that we're under NSPM 13, how has the sort of defend forward model changed the ability to operate, especially in gray space, when it comes to non-state actors?
Okay.
So the only thing I have to speak to that is public comments and reporting after the fact. The sense I get is that the capability to operate in gray space is entirely, if not mostly, dependent on coalition building and notifications and a communicative process. And there are actually documents in the collection that speak to that. I do know Ash Carter voiced a little bit of frustration along those lines. But as we know, as Joint Task Force Aries is still going, there's a learning process that continued long after those comments were made. And so I would, at the top of that question, just highlight that coalition building seems to be perceived as the key to operating in that gray space. And perhaps, if you approach it through coalition building, that gray space could become blue space.
I want to direct that question as well to Audrey, because I know you had some good points you were making earlier about this interaction with the private sector and thinking about that coalition as more than just political entities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think what's so interesting about this change and what we see is as these tools, or as the movement becomes more accessible to a range of actors around the world, so you can be a part of ISIS even if you aren't in ISIS-controlled territory. Increasingly evident is all of the players that means that affects and that entails. So it's really not just your responsibility or the military's responsibility, but we have challenges with it crossing our borders. So it becomes FBI, DHS, as well as State Department. So what does it mean in terms of trying to get these folks to synergize, and then adding in, you have technology providers. So not only do you have Facebook, YouTube, Google, but then also all of these smaller apps that are being exploited that often don't have the capability or skill set to do what we want them to do, whether it's formalizing procedures so that folks can work with them or request information. We have, especially in Europe, there are a lot of different referral models. So they'll basically flag content and ask them to take it down, but they don't have time to evaluate the legitimacy of those takedowns. So most recently, archive.org wrote a report because the French IRU actually requested them to take down the page for the Grateful Dead, as along with the Smithsonian Archive. So these were mistakes. They also requested, the French IRU asked archive.org to take down, what was it, a report from Voice of America about violent extremism online. So as we sort of look at all of this, holding each other responsible for, whose job is this? And have we outsourced a lot of our fight to the role of technology providers in terms of removing content and moderating content? And how much do we lean on them versus saying, this is actually the government's responsibility to either develop regulations to incentivize technology provider compliance, or looking at that conversation. So I think not only is it sort of a gray space of legal responsibility, but also whose legal responsibility is it?
I definitely want to avoid the blowback from the Grateful Dead community.
Yeah, the main community.
I think that, touching on sort of quite a few of those issues, is everyone's saying that this is a learning process, and it is. But again, if you go back to, and it's much easier to talk about this through other domains. If you look back at aviation, for example, at the birth of aviation, it was an evolutionary process, and it is still evolving all the time. The challenge within the cyber domain is that you'll have actors that aren't what they would normally be as a traditional actor. So it would be that if you had an air force, you were up against generally another air force. It was a fairly easy sort of balance to see how to operate and go against each other. But right now we've got commercial enterprise right on the front line of this, because there is no delineating in this. Everybody can be effectively on the front line, be it government, be it military, be it civilian, be it commercial. So that's why everything that everyone's alluded to about that public-private partnership, especially at the nation state and international level, is utterly crucial in this space.
We have a question going to be up front, but I want to tack something onto that quickly, because I think you just made a really intriguing point that we don't talk about very much. There's periods of divergence and convergence and how organizations are building to fight and execute these sorts of missions. the air war in particular, even during World War I, there are at times radically different approaches to how air power is going to be used between the Brits and the Germans in particular. Are we, and then at times they start to look very similar to each other in the kinds of equipment that they're building and the sort of fight that they're pursuing. Are we right now thinking about these kinds of missions and understanding the limitations and what we can say? Would folks on the panel say we're generally moving towards a period of convergence and how these missions are being executed, or divergence between the sort of actors that we've discussed or would be talking about in space? This is a tricky question, so I'm open to anybody who's able to make a comment.
Well, if I
Please.
could, I'll get one more off the plate. First of all, I've seen Ash Carter's comments, and I wish he'd see JTF Ares today, because it's 180 out from what he described, and quite honestly, there were some frustrations with how we are, at the time, going to operate in gray space, even with a terrorist designation or a terrorist fighter. So I can't speak specifically to where the authorities are with NSPM 13, obviously, but I will reference Defend Forward and where General Nakasone and his intent is with Defend Forward, because there has been some discussion with this lately as far as what does that mean for cyber command. You've heard the reference of a Navy ships. We're not going to leave them in port. We're going to be out, at sea, understanding and learning the enemy. It's the same sort of reality with where we are at cyber. When we are going to go up against either, in my case, violent extremists, or if we're going against a state actor, we are going to defend forward, because we're not going to wait inside of our network for an attack to happen and then work from our own foxhole, right? We have to get out there. We've always gone out a little bit further than our front lines to understand what the enemy's doing, what they're planning, and sometimes, quite honestly, to let them know that we're there. And if you mess with us, we are here, and these are some of the capabilities that we have. So there's a messaging there with Defend Forward. So the enemy does have some sort of second thought, or maybe realizing that there's going to be some sort of reaction from either U.S. Cyber Command or forces, or U.S. forces, with regards to the environment that's out there that we currently operate in, right? We have to understand it's broad. It's going to be a large problem for us to discover. So Defend Forward is just that. It's really us learning more about the enemy. So as far as how that's tied to NSPM 13, maybe not, I wouldn't say directly. There's just been some change in authorities. And I think, quite honestly, where we're going with how we talk about Cyber Command and what our operations are, that we'll see some of this even continue to open up more, as you've referenced, sort of a quick turnaround with the FOIA requests. Cyber Command in general wants to get this out. We want to tell you all what we're doing. So as you've mentioned, with the low barrier for entry, right, with adversaries that are out there, a reason that some of this is extremely classified, or has been previously extremely classified, is because the hurdle to get into this environment isn't that high. This isn't nuclear war. So anybody with a laptop in a cafe can suddenly be out there and in the same tactical environment that we're operating as a JTF Ares. So we have to keep what we're doing under fairly tight wraps, because it's if you're technically savvy, it's easy to get into this. It's easy to get into this environment, as we've seen with what ISIS has done. So I think that is more the reason for overclassification, or I say overclassification, but for such a high classification of what we do, is to keep that from the adversary, as Nina mentioned earlier. When we talk about some of these things, and from the amount of white out spaces on your FOIA request that I'm not here to fill in today, we're going to tell you what we can. But some of those things may, quite honestly, be very simple, and we just need to make sure we protect those.
Fair. Dr.
Trey, to your point on convergence, where we are in the space, we just having had a long set of conversations with our friends in the UK and talking about the state of defensive versus offensive capabilities within a country's defense capacity. So we're not talking just intel, we're talking defense. There is the United States is definitely ahead of the game when it comes to working beautifully with its intel agencies. And in the United States, the Department of Defense, as much as we complain about overclassification or the difficulty of working through authorities, our allies globally have differences in their capacity to work between defense and the intel agency. And that linkage, because that intel agency is the one that's the most equipped to start sort of doing the kind of cyber work that they need to build these offensive capacities. So from an offensive standpoint so far, right, my understanding is that the United States is actually one of the leaders in the space, and everybody else is on the follow. Conversely, on blue space, how well we're securing and defending, that's a different story. And I think there are a lot of countries in the world now that are doing this as well or maybe better, just based on the structure of their systems.
That's great. So I want to go back out for questions. I know we had one up here in the front. Dr. Lim.
Hi, Herb Lynn, Stanford University. So in your introductory comments, what I heard was that there was the initial request for support from a cyber-ish kind of entity was a global. Well, it wasn't restricted to any particular geographic location. I also heard a lot about a valued preservation of American values and so on in observing the Constitution and civil rights and all those sorts of things, which you're all sworn to defend the Constitution, and this is clearly a good thing and so on. So my question is whether you could comment on the implications of ISIL related activities becoming more centered in the United States, and what that will do to your ability to operate, because the Cyber Command isn't going to go around and hack into American, presumably computers that are belonging to U.S. persons without proper authorizations and so on. And it seems to me that would introduce many more complications in your ability to operate quickly. So I was wondering if anybody could comment on that.
I'd love to comment. So as you know, with DoD and for NSA in general, if doesn't have a foreign fighter flair, we are not interested. If we do come across it, though, however, we're going to pass it off to our great partners at FBI or Department of Homeland Security. So we come from either the Title 10 or Title 50 world, turn it over to Title 18, hopefully a warm handoff, and that's really the last we see of it. Unfortunately, when you see in the news, doesn't include all the FBI arrests, the prosecutions the Department of Justice has had success with this year. We're rolling up ISIS in America quite often, actually. Singles, ones and twos here and there, but the FBI is out there doing that good work right here in the U.S. So that's how we, I don't want to say we just hand everything off to the FBI, but Herb, you're right. There is a portion of lawfare here, right, where they understand where our limitations are, where cyber's limitations are. But I'm here to tell you our Homeland Security and FBI agencies are fully capable for the online threat. Go ahead, Herb. I can hear you.
Do it.
At the scale at which I'm imagining that domestic ISIL-related activities are happening, I can believe that.
Yeah.
So, in other words, that's the inference I would have made, that the vast bulk of ISIL activity is done outside the United States, and you have a relatively free hand there. But when it comes to operating within the United States, it's more complicated for all the reasons that you described. I'm contemplating as your tactics become. If I were ISIL, I would be trying to shift much more of my activity into the United States, and therefore increase the domestic footprint for exactly the kinds of coordination reasons that you're mentioning. And a second point.
I would say that in that point, they'd be making a very poor choice concerning the capabilities of the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security.
That's an offline conversation. But the other point is that if in fact, I have no reason to doubt what you say, that what you say is absolutely true about many successes with FBI, DHS, and so on against ISIL. That story ought to be brought out, and somebody ought to be coordinating that story with Cyber Command to put it all under one roof. Okay, if you have a successful coordination there, that's really important, and we ought to know about that.
Okay, thanks, Herb.
So, and to sort of piggyback on this and get into the cases are really what interest me and what I can bring to the table. So prior to joining the team at West Point, I worked for an organization called the Program on Extremism at George Washington University, where our one true love was looking at court documents and court filings as they pertain to a lot of these directed attacks that were inside the United States. So to have a candid conversation about this is ISIS probably would try to do that if they could. But it's very hard to do when a lot of their media offices have completely crumbled. Much like earlier iterations of the war against AQI, the US has targeted a lot of their military or their messaging capabilities in terms of hitting offices. And we know that because we start to see research and documentation come out of it, or we know that certain media officials have been targeted. They have a very difficult time keeping their main spokespeople and media officials alive. So then tracing back to look at when were they really strong in terms of directing attacks? Right around the time that JTF Ares is coming around, when they were starting to direct attacks abroad, when they were trying to get Americans. There's a great piece about this that was actually published in the CTC Sentinel, and I'd be happy to chat with you about it later. Junaid Hussain was talking to several people in the United States, including 2 folks who tried to attack a cartoon convention in Texas. It was an unsuccessful attack because they were killed pretty much as they were driving up to the cartoon competition where they were. It was mocking the Prophet Muhammad, so that was sort of their target, and Pamela Geller, who was leading the event. But so none of these attacks were really that successful. Why? Because they were all disrupted. They were watching these communications, they were using them effectively. There was clear connection between communications between who was monitoring things abroad and who was monitoring things in the US. Mm-hmm. And that's really the closest they came to really successful attacks, because most of these were disrupted and we publicly have found out about it. So I think that you're absolutely right that ISIS has wanted to do that. We saw them try to do that across Europe. But at the same time, their capability to do so has been deeply stifled. And one thing that we haven't really talked about that is part of what we've learned from the documentation is a lot of it is about deconfliction, figuring out who is who in this information environment, to sort of say, okay, this guy is working with us, or this guy is not somebody, or this person is legitimate. So, and even though we don't know tons about what the deconfliction process is here, is as we're working in this sort of gray environment where there are so many different players, including journalists, researchers. You know, I've had tons of different social media accounts where I pretend to be a jihadist so I can figure out how they're using these tools. So we have to deconflict that. And where do we think it goes to? These sort of shared partnerships where you guys are communicating about, okay, who's a real target versus who isn't.
It's a great point that you bring up. And actually, again, if you look across conflict throughout history, adversaries will attack where they perceive weakness. And that weakness can either be in capability, a geographic position, supply chain would have been the classic, still currently. But that can also be collaboration and cooperation. And one of the challenges in the cyber domain is because the adversary can be multifactorial in how they present themselves. The organizational structures, both nationally and internationally, we're still developing what they look like in order to deal with these as threats. The danger is an adversary finding a way to attack down policy boundaries, where there are challenges of cooperation and collaboration across those policy boundaries. So the more that we can, from national perspectives, so the work that Nina and the team are doing on the new strategy and Defend Forwards, the work that's being done at the UN and international collaboration and cooperation, they're utterly crucial to try and break down some of those boundaries so that the international community is able to work on this. Because we have to, because otherwise we're going to have issues where non-state actors are going to be able to have disproportionately a large effect simply because they're attacking down those lines.
It's good to go back up for questions. Here, sir.
Hi, Mark Parmerlo with Fifth Domain. General Anderson, I'd be curious what changes JTF Ares has undergone since the beginning. I guess, for example, are you looking at other ISIS elements outside of the Levant? And are you looking at other similar entities that are operating globally? And if so, how are you kind of deconflicting that with other headquarters elements at U.S. Cyber Command?
Sure. Okay, I can talk to that. So yes, obviously the main reason for JTF Ares' focus in the Levant at the time was ISIS core, obviously a physical caliphate at the time, And now as that physical caliphate has gone away, and now we're focused on the digital caliphate, which is worldwide, it's global, and that's where JTF Ares is going to be. We, and what I would like to do is be wherever Ares appears on the internet or on the globe. That would be obviously an end state for us to be. I can't always get there. We can't always be where ISIS is going to show up. I'm not always developed into their, or I should say my teams aren't in their networks that are fully developed. But yes, to answer your question, from Southeast Asia, Africa, all through any of the other wilayats there, we're looking and studying ISIS. We are there in their network. We want to know what they're doing. We want to know how they're moving money, and sometimes we'll let them know we're there. Our mission is to keep ISIS, as you've all probably heard in this room, with 2+3 and our prioritization against nation states, terrorism being sort of that ambient threat that's going to be constant. It is my job to work myself out of a job and keep terrorists at the number 5 priority. So. Yeah, absolutely. What about them? And we are studying, and we are, I would say, keeping an eye on what Al-Qaeda is doing, because they are just as much of a threat against the United States, and of course the original threat against the United States, I would argue, which is where our great partnership with NSA comes in. So with Joint Task Force Ares, as you can imagine, I don't have an unlimited supply of manpower. I wish I did. We're hiring, by the way, if there's any operators that are out there watching. But I have to prioritize where we're going to focus our efforts at JTF Ares on a trans-regional threat. And right now, as far as threats to the West or external operations, it's going to be primarily ISIS focused. They're the ones that are the most dangerous to us now. But due to our broad partnership across the counterterrorism industry, and not only with that, with the National Counterterrorism Center, we are aware and will be prepared to act with Al-Qaeda or against Al-Qaeda operatives.
Appreciate that. We had a question back here.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you. Hi. Alan Dunnerman from MITRE. Earlier we alluded to sort of the JTF Ares operational planning and execution processes and frameworks aligning to MAR4, or JTF MAR4 Cyber, aligning upstream to other JTFs. JTFs are predominantly a characteristic of the OIF, OEF environment. Do we expect, or can we glean lessons learned about effectiveness of these types of processes and force structures if we pivot to a near-peer threat in more traditional force structures and how we fight maybe in Europe or Pacific? Thank you.
I could take that.
Let's go to Nita first and take some of the stress off.
I feel like it's my fault that
General
he's
Anderson's
asking.
stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but okay.
Go ahead. Give some color commentary.
So out of the, it's funny because I asked this question and then I sort of didn't think very deeply about what would be different about it. What I will say is this, that away from the task force model, there is, in order to make fundamental changes to how the U.S. military does war, it takes a long process of adjustment. So there's a doctrine, there's training, there's all of sorts of things that have to, it's called the .mil PFP. And that whole set of institutions, that whole set of documents and processes and exercises and tests and metrics have to realign under a new set of operations, under a new set of, and under a new sort of logic, a new set of roles. So combing cyber through all of that process. Cyber isn't going to revolutionize the military processes, right? It's still land, sea, air, right, and then a couple extra new domains. So I think the real question is, how long will it take for the United States Department of Defense to fully implement cyber in all of its roles and capacities? And I think once you have that picture done, you'll have a better understanding of how state-on-state conflict would occur, because it's got to synchronize effectively with how we do business at sea, how we do business under the water, how we do business on land, and that's a longer process. But it's one that the task force is looking at directly, and that's about implementation and normalizing cyber as a function, as a function that happens within each of the services, within each specialization.
I would say the task force is there because at the time, as Cyber Command was growing, right, very nascent. So we had to take forces from across all the I should say Fleet Cyber, Air Force, Army, everybody came together to stand up Joint Task Force Ares. Now, as we've grown and we've added staff and we continue to grow, while a task force structure certainly works against an adversary or an emerging adversary that's out there, as we get to our fully manning, we'll start seeing some of the personnel, in my particular case at MAR 4 Cyber, and I'll see the number of Marines creeping up as our manning continues to level, and the other forces sort of going away and now manning their own Joint Force headquarters, if that makes sense. So once we have the specialties aligned, we've tackled the problem, then it'll kind of normalize itself. I don't think it's always going to be a task force structure after this, task force after that. It is a good idea, and it does work, but it might be temporary in nature. I hope Joint Task Force Ares is around for a while, but it might certainly go away. So it's a balance of that. I don't know if that really gets to your question, but I don't think it defines what this force is going to look like permanently. We're still working on that, to be honest. We're still figuring out what works best for us as far as our force structure goes.
Mike, do you want to take it?
If I could also raise a point, I've heard this distinction made a couple times. It might not have been meant the way I may have taken it, but I think we're making a distinction between state and non-state actors in cyberspace, and maybe drawing too much space between them in terms of how they operate in cyberspace. Certainly, nations like Russia, like China, are going to have, clearly state-aligned, very high sophistication capabilities. They're also going to have a whole bunch of, shall we say, state-centric, maybe deniable groups, proxy groups that, if you're only looking at the network space, might actually operate in ways really similar to how ISIS operated in a network space, particularly if they're running, say, influence campaigns. And so I think we also, as we're trying to draw lessons from JTF Ares out into areas of great power competition, start looking at the middle bit of the Venn diagram between how states and non-state actors operate in cyberspace, because I think there is a lot to port over, and it would be a shame to have to reinvent the wheel when we need it.
That's great points. One question right up here.
Thank you. I'm Dave Rubinowitz. I'm a retired technical person. The general mentioned that among his operators he hasn't seen a hoodie. That makes me nervous, because the adversaries almost certainly have hoodies or their cultural equivalent. And that's a different mentality, and it seems that it'd be valuable to have that mentality represented on our side at least. I'm just wondering, is the fact that there are no hoodies just the way it turned out, or are they actively discouraged from participating, and is that a good policy?
All right, so, sir, thanks for that question. I didn't say it's a policy. I would just say that we don't, I would say that our force, as a professional force online, you're right. I do want the cognitive diversity across the entire space of cyber to get after the problem, and we have that. Just because we don't have hoodies doesn't mean I don't have guys and gals with multiple earrings, tattoos. Believe me, I've got culture. I've got plenty of culture. It just so happens they're not wearing hoodies. I just picked out one thing, but there's absolutely a diversity in that. I'm only 40% military, right? 60% of our force is civilian. So it's important to understand that they're working for us in the nation's interest to get after this problem. We're all working in the same spaces. There is no divide, really, between the professionalism between the military and the professionalism with the civilians that are working for us. We're actually absolutely in lockstep, regardless of what they're wearing or how they look. They're very talented individuals. So thanks for clarifying that for me, sir. You're right. I have a few hoodies at home. Maybe I'll bring them into work.
I want to direct the hoodie capability question here across the pond for a minute as well, if we could.
We are giggling slightly, but it gives the opportunity to make a good point, which is the challenge we may be facing is a technology and connectivity one. So the challenge that we've got is firmly rooted in technology, but the solution isn't. If we try to root our solutions in technology, we will remain in constant lag. So this is one where actually we have to project our sort of like thinking forwards, and this is why strategy, the projecting forwards on strategy is really important, because it's only through a good use and application of strategy will you get ahead of a technological challenge, because the tail is so long to improve things. We've spoken a lot that actually this is not an individual nation challenge. This is a multinational challenge. Therefore, you can only generate that sort of multinational cohesiveness with long-term strategy. So in all of this debate, yes, technology is really important, and therefore you really have to have the people that understand that technology. But to make real key big changes long-term, you need the strategy, which means that you don't just need those hooded hackers or good faith researchers, whatever we want to call them. You also need the translators that can go from that technology piece all the way up to grand and international strategy. And success will come from having those translators and having a mix of and balance of personnel all the way through.
And then I think this is primarily an offensive forward panel that we're talking about here, but one of the components of the Solarium itself is to look at a resilience, and that's the national level resilience, and that's both for private sector as well as the DOD and the DoD networks. And so I think it's definitely a big question for the Solarium to think about this, not just offensive but defensive capabilities. And one of the things we don't often talk about is the role of everything else, given the threat that might come from cyber, and in particular critical infrastructure. So when we talk about things like having IT, OT, or what do they call this? SCADA systems vulnerabilities in our water supply or electrical grids, right? So we often talk about this. We want to do sort of important cybery things to counteract that. And that's important as well. But to be perfectly honest, if you cut off the electricity to New York City, my first question is not, where did it come from? My question is, how long until electricity comes back up? Do I need to start busing millions of people off Manhattan? I mean, it is a FEMA response. It is a water basic infrastructure trying to control for what looks like a natural disaster response. And so making sure we move that whole conversation beyond just the technical, just beyond the code, to all the way to like, how do you get to honest resilience? How do we know how to move 1 million people out of a city if there's a water attack? That's a serious question.
I want to take moderator's prerogative here for a second. So this alludes to a conversation that's been going on in War in the Rocks over the last couple of weeks about combat culture, particularly with the notion of cyber warrior and what that term meant. Talking in particular to Pete, Nina, and General Anderson, I want to see, how do you see these kinds of fights shaping the combat culture of these organizations over the next 10 to 15 years? And is it possible to preserve what have been historically some fairly specific set of traditions with how we execute kinetic combat missions in this new, much more collaborative, much more information-driven space, i.e. every Marine or rifleman? Do I need to preserve that capability as I look out the next 10 to 15 years in this fight rather than generally across all fights?
I think I can get after that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I understand your question with regards to, I guess, the individual warrior ethos that we need in Cyber Command. Is that what we're getting at?
Sure.
It's funny. I was a little bit, my heart rate got up this weekend. There's a popular blog out there, and somebody had written, I think the title of there was, "You should not call cyber warriors warriors." It was something to that effect, which to me is a little disappointing, and I think just due to being a little bit naive as far as what these Marines and civilians are doing in this environment, because it is constant. It's operational. It's day to day. We are constantly tested by the adversary. And I would say, state on state side for Cyber Command in general has a larger play in that than where I am with violent extremists. But yes, to maintain that sort of warrior ethos as far as where we are in supporting the kinetic fight, there's been some comment or discussion in the fact that cyber is, or the discovery that cyber is integrated in kinetic. Of course it's connected in the kinetic fight. We are supporting arm to what is happening on the ground. Like you said, every Marine a rifleman. I'm used to that. F-18 pilot. I've been a supporting effort of that Marine on the ground, and now here I am doing the same thing, same sort of planning, almost exactly the same way we get there, as Pete can allude to, as far as what we see planning for aviation, what our culture is there in the ready room, and how we view warfare to where we are now in cyber. It's just a different way of getting there, a different final effect that's delivered, but it is still the same important mission that's absolutely supporting the Marine on the ground. And I would say 10 to 15 years from now, they're going to want it even more. There's going to be a point, I think, in our warfare where we find ourselves on the ground going up against an adversary, because it's going to be infantry that does that final step, right? It always is. But there's going to be a point where we won't be able to operate without cyber there. So what I'm getting at is we can conduct kinetic operations right now without necessarily having cyber command support. I think 10 to 15 years from now, that's going to be a lot different. Not only are we going to need cyber support offensively, but we are definitely going to need cyber support defensively. If you don't think the enemy is looking at how we communicate, how we're using links, how we're using full motion video, you'd be remiss to think that they're not trying to figure out how to disrupt our C2, right? So we have to be ready for that.
As kind of a follow-on question to that, I mean, cyber security, or cyber is definitely or can be a supporting function. But I think we're also seeing lots of instances where cyber is the central strategic function, where it's not directly supporting a Marine or a soldier on the ground. And so I wonder, how does that play into the cultural makeup, where it is a supporting, but it's not always a supporting?
I would say, Michael, that actually if there are some very rare occasions where it is a singular cyber operation, that's going to be a very rare occurrence. We are always going to be part of a smaller campaign plan. I take a look at it as we go against the as we go against our operations with ISIS core, right? I could take one cyber effect, put it towards the Death Star, and it's just going to hit the outside of the Death Star and not do much. So we have to be part of a campaign plan that's involving maybe kinetic, maybe legal aspects, maybe some local arrests. That all ties in. It doesn't necessarily have to be something, like you said, kinetic on the ground. There might be some one-offs where it's just cyber, but quite honestly, we get a better effect that's amplified with a coordinated effort from all of our partners and folks on the ground. I would say that definitely the exclusion than the norm.
Just going to add briefly on that is that, again, if you look through history, operations that have attempted to use a single domain to achieve their aims have generally been pretty poor. And have had real challenges. The operations that have seen, even going back to World War II, things like that, you see the operations that actually wove in air, land, sea. Those are the ones that had real effect, and actually the adversary would have a real issue in trying to defend against those. That principle still extends now as we sort of come onto this new domain with every single domain that we've got. It's being able to weave everything together. Therefore, you can't have one element of that not being seen as a warfighter, for example. Everyone's got to have the same ethos, aim, strategy, policy, so that everyone can actually work together. And that's, I think, increasingly what's going to be happening and what we're going to be seeing over the years.
I think someone has some opinions on this.
I feel like Trey baited me into this one. Yeah, so I think my colleagues we're dancing around the question just a little bit, which is that when you say this is what a warrior, this is what a warfighter looks like, the question is, what are the characteristics you're looking at? And so, by and large, the culture of selection for the U.S. military has been to select on physicality, right? So it's legs. If you have legs, you can be a warfighter, maybe. We have to do enough push-ups and a fireman's carry. And the question is, can we broaden the definition of what it means to be a warfighter enough so that you have every possible person who has the capacity to sling serious code or do serious network ops? Will they find in themselves when you say, join up, join us, and defend this nation? Will they find in themselves the image of not exactly a set of legs, right? So what happens to those people? So that's the question, I think, that we haven't been able to quite topple, the culture of it's the physical that's first. And it's the case that all the domains matter. And yes, taking and holding ground matters too. But it's also the case that the Air Force does a lot of work, and the Navy does a lot of work, and the Merchant Marine did a lot of work. And so it's not always just legs, and the question is, can we make that pivot in who counts as a warfighter? As somebody who just does time on the keyboard, who just does time working network cables? That's the question.
And maybe that's a question for us to come back to in the next, say, 5 years. I think, Brigadier General, as you're talking about, if this is going to become increasingly a feature of the battle space, the thing that jumps to mind is, right, the Marine Corps introducing the CFT as a response to what they felt were differing levels of combat conditioning relative to the core PFT results in each year. And are we going to see something like that come out of these kinds of engagements where there's either a new training metric or a new piece of the pipeline and that man train and equip issue that starts to address technical competence, this sort of collaborative capability, teamwork almost more explicitly. But this is interesting. I think it's good crosstalk. I want to go back out. Questions here? Yes, sir.
I will say this first.
Yes,
as
sorry.
we go to the next question. We will always be Marines. There's going to be a standard that we are going to be a Marine first. But like I said, we are going to hire civilians. You might not necessarily, wear the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor, but you're going to be part of the Marine Corps team, regardless of whether or not you can do a fireman's carry. But the Marine Corps, as far as our training and qualifications, that won't change.
Good to go.
Thanks. Nick here. I'm a senior cyber analyst and previous member of JTF Ares. So to take the heat off of General Anderson real quick to get the perspective from the civilians in the room. So the question of cyber sovereignty, so that drove a lot of the questions in planning with the notification from the FOIA agreement, from the FOIA documents and things like that, which we've evolved from that today from within the DoD, but I want to see, and I would hope that the discussion would go into, in the civilian world, what is cyber sovereignty? What are we accepting for the non-state actor fight for this discussion? Country A, country B has a border, walking over the border into country B, that's a Title 10 act of war. It's very different in cyberspace, especially given the virtual nature, distributed infrastructure, virtual services across the world. So that was a huge challenge, and I'd love to hear the perspective of the group on what is cyber sovereignty, especially moving forward. Thank you.
Do you want to start that? Yeah. So diving in, I think as a representative of the panel, I'm the least cyber oriented so much as I focus just more on how are ISIS sympathizers and their networks using these technologies, not so much just specializing on the military response to that. But I think the really important thing to look at here is it's a trade-off. And it's a trade-off like all security decisions that we're making. And I think when we look at the coalition here and our allies and partners in this is a really big, important angle of it, because if we want to do something in there's a server in another country, are we going to work with them to get access or take down that server? Or how are we going to target these spaces that are problematic but are in this weird liminal jurisdiction? So I think that this is a challenge that we've seen and has been critiqued by some in the past, but also commended by others. And it's something that we're actually going to have to work towards and develop better understanding. In the back earlier, we were talking a lot about how this actually just means that norms are coming under question in a way that really deserve scrutiny and further discussion, because the reality is this isn't a one-time problem. So not only is it sort of the jurisdictional problem and who has authority to do what, but especially as we start to get into this gray space too, and we've sort of breached on this but never fully crossed the threshold. The reality is that we've seen groups affiliated with Russia act as if they are ISIS sympathizers taking over a French media network. It takes takes longer to diagnose that. So in one sense, we have fear because terrorism, depending on which definition you use, is really that fear and intimidation component. So people are scared because they think that ISIS has attacked this network and taken down this French network. But time reveals that it's not actually ISIS at all. It's a group affiliated with this Russian network of, I don't know if we're allowed to say hackers yet, but
You can call them hackers.
yeah, okay. I just want to check and make sure my nomenclature is okay. But yeah, so then past that, we also see a Tunisian hacker collective as part of the attribution for the NHS. So not only are we getting into this liminal space about where can we operate and where can't we, and who are our allies and who aren't, but who are we targeting and what is their affiliation to the state, non-state matrix? And that takes more time than just 24 hours or to be able to respond really quickly. So although I don't have an answer for you and definitely going to punt the ball, I think that this is a really vital discussion to be having, not just within this room, but also beyond here, for the State Department, for looking at even DHS, NCTC, because the reality is also that it's not just jihadist-inspired extremism that we have on the horizon, but pushing far past that.
Go for it. No.
You want to do it?
Yeah, I think Pete, let's go to
So
Pete.
yeah, so Sitting here under the lights with a question like that, I am not going to answer the question. I'm not going to be able to answer the question on cyber sovereignty because there is no answer to it yet. But I think that the really important thing that has to happen is that dialogue, it has to be a broad dialogue. Because if you go right back, I mean, Clausewitz came up with talking about the use of force, and then out of that, all of our laws and norms around warfare developed. He didn't really see the cyber domain coming, and I don't blame him. But if you look at the dialogue that's happened through both at the UN and the Tallinn Manual 1 and 2, there's some really good dialogue and debate going on, but we're still struggling to find out what that answer is. That there is not going to be a sudden that's the answer. This is going to take years of debate and evolutionary discussion going forwards. But it's not going to be easy, but when that debate happens, it has to happen in conjunction with government and also industry in that partnership, because when we talk about the grey space, that grey space, a lot of it is commercially owned. So when this is being discussed at the UN, whatever we are doing, however we're taking that forwards, it has to be collaborative.
I think there's also sort of an underlying fundamental question here, which is, are we conceiving of cyber operations as military operations or intelligence operations? Because how we interact with the question of sovereignty, I think, depends a bit on that. Intelligence collection, we've chosen not to decide as a violation of sovereignty. A military cyber operation on, or an intelligence cyber operation on, say, a telecom company trying to intercept traffic can still be treated in the public as a violation of sovereignty. So I think there's that fundamental question that we haven't quite figured out yet. And I don't think we can really answer the sovereignty questions until we figure that one out.
So I'm going to have to turn to my fellow international relations nerds. Was it Krasner that did Organized Hypocrisy?
Yeah.
It's a book called Organized Hypocrisy that talks about the fundamental concept of sovereignty. And I think it's Krasner. I feel bad now, so I'm going to Google it quickly. Thank you. So in the book, Organized Hypocrisy, the argument is that there is no single definition of sovereignty, that sovereignty is managed in different ways. And so if we're talking about physically crossing a border, that's one kind of sovereignty. But if we're talking about doing trade, that's a different kind of sovereignty, right? You give up certain aspects, and the flavor of what sovereignty is changes when it comes to international law, right? Agreeing to a treaty or agreeing to an international convention, it is not necessarily the elimination of sovereignty, right? It's actually the reaffirmation of it. So all this by way of saying it depends on partially what the intervention is about, but partially on the multiple agreements that are going to have to get hammered out in order for these sorts of things to work out. So I don't see a future where international collaboration in security collectives regarding cyber ops is a thing. It seems too clunky, it seems too hard to negotiate. What it seems to me is that over time we'll probably see one state start doing unilateral agreements with another state regarding offensive and defensive collaboration, and then maybe some subset of firms within that state. But I have a harder time imagining sort of a blanket NATO kind of sovereignty agreement when it comes to cyber operations in particular. But it will work itself out as the laws work themselves out. I think the really tricky part is going to be just the international firms. Banks don't understand themselves as being US based. They don't understand themselves being Hong Kong based. They understand themselves as having footprints all over the world, and I'm not sure how to get that to work, but I think it'll come.
It was Krasner, by the way. I do want to tack on to that for a second, because I think it speaks to a really important point. Some companies that are multinational in nature do still think of themselves as jurisdictionally specific because of what they do. The technology and banking, I think in particular, there's a lot of sensitivities to where they operate and how they operate as a result. But the other piece is there's a practical ownership issue. If I'm going to have to move over an entity's network, that entity is known, that infrastructure is owned, and there's somebody I can point to as an operator, I may choose not to interact with that operator, but I at least often have a good indication or a good sense of who that individual is, even down to the specific person. So I think the question that comes out is going to be as much about whether I want to notify and deconflict or delimit against that network versus do I know who to talk to do that. So I think there's a distinction to be drawn there. We have a gentleman here right in the middle. Yep, Simon.
Thank you. Martin Bengtsson from Sweden. I have a background in defense and intelligence, but I'm here as a private citizen right now. Married the wrong woman, not the right woman, but so I ended up in DC instead. So my question is perfectly, or only from a private perspective. That's my point. I was wondering if anyone could talk to your views on the nexus between organized crime and terrorism. I mean, there are a lot of nexuses or aspects of nexus, but on the technology side, we've mentioned like the use of Telegram, for example, or file sharing apps, and who is teaching who there. And there's also the divide between state and non-state actors, where in Europe at least we discussed the risk of state actors being able to use the criminal organized crime for doing things. For example, in Europe we're afraid of the Russians, for example, using Russian organized crime. And we look at the terrorist attacks in Sweden, in New York, Saipov here. They have the same thing, Uzbek people coming, living partly attached to the organized crime of their background, Uzbek background, Central Asian background in respective country. And in other parts of Europe, it's the North African organized crime gangs. There are then people all of a sudden turns out to do lone wolf attacks. And if you work together, for example, in the task force, do you have police forces inside the task force? That's my question.
All right, to answer that last part, I do not have police forces as part of the task force, but we do, again, maintain a relationship with law enforcement. I think we've learned things from what we see from those criminal organizations and how they act, because you're exactly right. Something that looks very similar in how terrorists or violent extremists are using apps, or quite honestly, how they're laundering money. And that's the one thing that we're really interested in, as far as how they're financing and raising money in violent extremist world. There will be no external operations if they're not funded. If they don't have cash, they're not going to do it. So we learned a little bit from how terrorist organizations do that, and violent extremists do it much the same way. I think what you'll see, and again, something to Herb's point earlier when we talk about FBI successes, September 10th, Department of Treasury announced 15 terrorist designations. Didn't even make the news, right? I'm not saying that JTF Ares was part of all of those, but when we designate somebody a terrorist and use that sort of activity to learn what they're doing out there in the finance space, and I say that being as a pilot. Let's say I'm on a strike mission. I go out, if I fly a strike mission, I'm going to observe what I see on the way to the target and back. My operators are doing the same thing in cyberspace. So they're going to come back and report to intelligence, hey, I saw this or this, or maybe there's some interesting finance piece here that we need to take a look at. And we push all this intelligence right back into the overall national intelligence, basically data. And if that can be used by Department of State, Department of Treasury, or anybody else to get a Treasury designation, that's a win for JTF Ares. I might not have had to hit an enter key and destroyed anybody's server or whatever other cyber sci-fi thing you want to push to put towards it. But if I can get a terrorist designation on somebody, make it harder for them to move their money across the internet, I've won. In that particular realm. We're not letting them just operate unfettered out there without bumping into things that we're doing at JTF Ares to make it harder for them to operate. I want them to think twice before they open up their laptop and log in and try to do something nefarious online. I would think, and I would understand that our FBI and other law organizations are doing that with the organized crime, especially near our southern border.
Okay. Coming back to the field. Right here in the pink. Yeah. Thanks, Shannon.
Shannon Vavra with Cyberscoop. This is a question for Brigadier General Anderson. Could you speak to how you are handling the threats from ISIS Khorasan, specifically in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Sure, I could talk to you a little bit about it. Cyberscoop, you said? All right, good. I read it every day, so just so I know what you guys got going on out there. So I would say this: ISIS, and what you've seen in open press, right? ISIS Khorasan, of course, has an external ops. They're a threat, and I would say, as our leadership has talked about, they are one of the higher threats as far as the organizations across ISIS. So, are we operating, or are we doing anything? Yes. The answer is JTF Ares is in and around where ISIS is operating. So I can't really say specifically what we have there, but I will say that we are out there trying to illuminate the network, trying to figure out how they're communicating, what they're using, and where the money might be flowing in there, or is there money. But yes, it is a concerted effort with what is going on in that region, particularly with we don't really know what's going to be happening with the Taliban and just a really strange political situation there in Afghanistan right now. In particular with ISIS, let's call it ISIS-K, or really ISIS in any region, as we looked at the possibility of U.S. forces even leaving. There's opportunities for us at Joint Task Force areas when we have either less overhead, right? We don't have any drones, or maybe we don't have an actual task force or any other kinetic option. Our only option to go in and get after these terrorists is going to be through non-kinetic means or through Joint Task Force areas. So this keeps our extended growth out there as far as what we understand about the network, and a way to at least influence the enemy through a specific offensive cyber operation or information operations that's going to still continue to, I would say, quell or keep that external operations planning or that external operations capability at bay, if that makes any sense. Okay.
We're going to go to our last question out of the field. You, sir, here in the back on the right side.
Hi, this is John Wagner. I'm actually the lead Inspector General for Overseas Contingency Operations. So we're assessing the progress in OIR in particular. And so my question is actually kind of twofold. The first is, what's the relationship between Task Force Ares and I guess the Task Force OIR? And then two, when you're assessing progress, how are you assessing progress? Specifically, well, if you could tell me what you think your progress has been, that would be great. But then also, when you're looking at the metrics you use, what metrics are you using and how are you developing the metrics? What's interesting is we talked a little bit earlier about limiting the number of communications that ISIS is putting out. That seems like just one side of a coin. I think we probably have to look at their influence on target audiences that they've identified. So is that part of the metric set? And if so, how are we assessing how audiences perceive ISIS?
Okay, great. Thanks for that question. As Michael has published in one of his articles, he's got the sort of the planning cycle, right? Number 6 being assessment, and I can tell you that assessment is difficult. It's one of the most difficult things that we can probably measure there in cyberspace. But I'll get to that in a second. First question, though, as far as our relationship with OIR. As you've seen in our, or maybe not, because I know you're probably deep into the joint publications, right? So JP 3TAC12, Cyberspace Operations, specifically lists Cyber Command as the supporting command for those COCOMs. So we are in support of OIR. So how are we integrated? We're planning with them. I would say we're planning with OIR daily, right? That is our focus. We know that ISIS core exists somewhere there, Iraq, Syria. We don't, we know that their focus and that nexus exists in that AOR. So we want to continue to maintain that presence in that continual operation with those planners. So we're there and we're coordinating with them all the time. We coordinate with our Five Eye partners, agencies, and mostly the coalition. We spoke about how we're going to get after, as we get after terrorism around the world, there's quite a coalition of countries that are in support of what we do and how we're going to get after this problem. So to get to the second piece of how do we measure it, we have those specific, measures we always like to put out, measures of effectiveness, right? As far as what that might look at, what we might look at. I'm going to give you the specific media one again, but in relation to how they're spreading their message, it's obvious through, at their height, they were putting out 300 or so products a month. They're down to a third of that. They're down to 100. It's primarily text-based. We're not seeing a lot of those, flashy movies, well-edited, narrated stuff online anymore. They don't have their own website anymore. We're not seeing this stuff pop up on our regular news on a regular basis because we've limited that capability, whether or not it's through cyber or through some of our kinetic successes with our CT enterprise. But when you see a drop in that messaging, we do view that as success. When we do conduct a cyber operation, or maybe we conduct some type of MISO or MILDEC operation, information support or military deception, and we wait for those reflections to come back. Remember, cyber, it might not happen immediately, right? I might have, or we might conduct an operation that we may not see effects, reverberating for a month, 60 days. Some of these things take a while. They age like fine wine, right? So, but in others, it happens immediately, and we can measure that. So with your point to media, yes, there's an ISIS message there, and there are going to be some ISIS curious or some believers out there that aren't going to let that message go. But I will say that the fact that industry, with their terms of service, have primarily removed a majority of that content off of Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, etc. And now they're, as Audrey's team over there at George Washington University put out a great report on how their use of Telegram, and in particular with the English-speaking chat rooms, and how they're limited to these private chat rooms now. The audience is not as broad as it used to be. I don't think the recruiting is out there as strong as it used to be. We're seeing that because there's not a lot of foreign fighters that are flowing into Iraq and Syria anymore. They're staying put. If you read, for anybody in here that's studying ISIS and looks at some of the media that they put out, I would say that most recently, when ISIS puts out messaging, or they put out a poster, quite honestly, that could be done by a high school grade graphic artist putting flames behind a Statue of Liberty and saying, New York, we're coming for you, the most legs that media gets is by our own news organizations, because otherwise it would be stuck on a private chat room somewhere that would hardly get any exposure. So we do it to ourselves, I think, more exposing what ISIS is doing out there online more than what we would consider. So to fully circle back to this, when we conduct or when we're planning an operation, we set out what it looks like now and what we expect it to look like after. And if it doesn't look like that after, then we know, okay, what were the changes there? What were the subtle differences that we need to make sure we did have some sort of effect on the enemy? It is a tough question. It's a tough problem to get after, especially when you're assessing messaging, because that's really what they're using that internet for. If I cut off financing, I know I've had an effect, right? That makes it, it's pretty easy to do. But it's hard to get inside somebody's head. As far as whether or not that message is going through, I will tell you it's very easy to get through somebody's head if you're trying to do it the other way, because it's the only operating system on the internet that you can't patch. So you can get into somebody's head and work the other way as well.
Mike?
I think there's also a hit to be brought back from the jukebox of, cyber isn't actually changing the way we do everything here. You can go back to the beginning of operations research as a field and deciding, are we going to put AA guns on the transatlantic convoys? Well, it depends. Are you saying your goal is to shoot down planes, or is your goal to deter plane attack? Because depending on how you ask that question, depending on how you define success here, you're going to be biased either for or against putting guns on ships that are unlikely to actually fire the guns or shoot down a plane. I think I've seen a lot of focus on, how do we know we're having effect on the network? And I'm not entirely certain that's the right question when the overall goal is deterring something ISIS is doing. So you can count and say, okay, we've interrupted this many messages, we've taken down this many videos. Okay, but the overall goal is to deter their ability to launch an attack. Maybe we should be measuring capacity or frequency of attacks, because that's ultimately what we're trying to do. Or at least prove an empirical link from one data point to the other.
Open up to the rest of the group. Anybody else on efficacy outcomes?
I think that this is one of the challenges that we're also facing today is what is our working definition of success?
Mm-hmm.
And who's defining success? Is a technology provider taking down content at a very effective rate? Is that our measure for success? Or how many posts that were legitimate that they took down is our measure for success? Or when somebody takes down a website, when does it rebound and come back? So I think that one of the challenges we really need to look at is why do we have such a short-term perspective of success when we actually really need to commit ourselves to a long game and say, well, what is efficacy? And sort of, are we being efficient in the short, medium, and long term? And how are we looking at these matrices of success and not just these binary, yes, no, is it down or is it not? And this is one of the key challenges. I did a big study that led on to the report that you just cited about Telegram that was looking at Twitter. And Twitter was very successful in taking down and pushing people off their platform, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a reduction in terrorism. Because if I'm a terrorist and my account is taken down, I'm not just going to say, well, we're done there. I mean, it was a good try. And I think that the resilience and dexterity and sort of this is what these groups are known for. So how can we mitigate them in this landscape and really marginalize them and set them to the side? Not just fully defeat, but really sow distrust. undercut the efficacy, or like undercut the influence of their products. Again, if I'm a terrorist, sorry, I'm a terrorist so many times in this example, and I go from seeing really flashy, 10-minute long thematic products that are telling me why this matters to like a pretty shoddy flames up of an attack in New York. Those are very different products in terms of strategic communication. So I think that that's slowly undercutting the influence and sort of trust in this movement, and that is also a metric for success on sort of our broader definition of that.
I use the, if I was going to recruit Marines, if I handed them a page of text, and this is explaining the Marine Corps, or I can have a video of going up a mountain and slaying a dragon with a sword, I'm probably going to get the guys when I show them the video of slaying a dragon with a sword. But I think not only the media point that we brought up, the Treasury point as far as designations, if we've contributed to that, if we've contributed to any other law enforcement effort, whether it's in Iraq or whether it's back here in the United States, those are all successes for JTF Ares and for Cyber Command if we've contributed to that in any shape or form.
I think it's also worth discussing metrics of success in the context of the private sector, because how we're defining success, especially in terms of takedowns, creates incentive structures that might lead them to an overzealous degree of takedowns, right? If it's, we'd like you to take down this many accounts, how concerned are you with how sure you are that account is actually ISIS linked? Or are you taking down was it Voice of America piece and putting that in the win column and moving on? So I think the metrics discussion can also contribute directly to the discussion of freedom of speech and civil rights as folks are trying to move forward with these operations.
And I think it's a good point that a colleague of ours is working on a piece summarizing these documents and part of this discussion, and made the point that this is truly an industrial form of warfare, and that in many cases what we're talking about measuring and trying to see outcomes are the outcomes of organizational behavior, whether that's on the battlefield or not. So rather than focusing on specific metrics, right, we're looking at trying to impact the efficacy and the activity of these organizations. We have hit and run past our time, so I want to give credit to the National Security Archive for the work that they're doing and for the focus of this discussion. Thank you for that. I also want to give a big thank you to our panelists. As I think you've seen, this is not an easy topic to talk about in an open, unclassified space, but I appreciate each of you coming and making the effort to do it. I think it's helped us and it's contributed to a more positive debate publicly. So please join me in thanking the group.